speaker. It is my pleasure to announce Leif Johnson from the University of Texas at Austin, so local, yay. He will tell us about Python tools for coding and feature learning. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Can everyone hear me? Sometimes I have a quiet voice, so tell me to speak up. All right. So I'm going to talk about, I'm a local student, a grad student in computer science here. And so it's my first time at SciPy. It's been a really great conference, but I wasn't quite sure what audience to expect. And so I thought, well, maybe you might, be confused about what I mean by coding. Like, am I talking about programming? Certainly not anything with malloc. Maybe I'm talking about those QR code things that people seem to want to use sometimes. No, that's not really right. What about cryptography? That's kind of like coding. But no, that's not exactly what I'm talking about either. I'm talking about more information theoretic kind of codes. So what I want to do is substitute frequent or complicated things with simpler or shorter things. Whoops, sorry, keep doing that. So if you used a mobile phone or hang around with a high schooler, you probably are familiar with some short abbreviations that people use for what I would call kind of coding, because it's a pain to type all these excuse me, letters on your phone. But this has actually been around for at least 100 years, probably much longer. So literally the Western Union company published a code book that was full of made-up words, and each made-up word stood for a bunch of sentences that you didn't want to send in full over your narrow telegraphic channel. So this idea has been around for quite a while, and I'm going to talk about some Python tools for doing this. So from a machine learning perspective, we might ask, why do you want to code things? There are many reasons, but the two that I think are easiest to explain are that in one case, you get easier classification. And so I've put a picture here of, I've taken a 2D point array of the unit circle, and I've coded it using a 3D dictionary using a sparse code. And you can see that it's a little hard to see here because it's a 2D projection of a 3D thing, which was originally a 2D thing. But the sparse code actually expands the dimensionality of that originally 2D data into 3 full dimensions. And so I've colored some blue points here by slicing them with a linear plane in 3D. And you can see that you get 2 distinct groups of points kind of for free once you've got this coded data. And it would be extremely difficult to get these disjoint points on the unit circle with a linear separator in 2D. Then the other reason is science. So it turns out that in this really beautiful paper by Olshausen Field, if you do the right kind of coding, you can actually shed some light on how neurons might be operating in the nervous system when exposed to natural data. So these are kind of cool things. So take a deep breath. We're going to talk about coding really quickly. So I'm going to set up my data set as a bunch of 2D data. For now, I'm just creating a bunch of random data. And we're living in 2D because our poor eyes, they're not very good at 4D, right? So we're kind of stuck with 2D for examples. The code book, or the dictionary, I'll use those terms interchangeably, is also 2D data. But you can have more than 2 of them. In such a case, it's called an over-complete dictionary. So here I've put just a few random, I've just created some random vectors in my 2D space to use as my dictionary. So the kind of simplest way to code something is just to project your data onto the dictionary. And this is a pretty straightforward way of doing it. It's just one operation. It's great. You can write it in math or in NumPy really easily. The tricky catch here is that you will always preserve the dimensionality of your data this way. So even if your data now live in 4D, they will always lie on a 2D subspace within that 4D space. And so, like I said earlier, if you're looking for classification in particular, you might want to get out of that 2D space. So a really simple way of doing that is just to threshold your projection. So you basically take all the small bits out and set them to 0, or the negative bits, or whatever you want to do. Scikit-learn has a great kind of catch-all sparse encode method that's really awesome. You can just throw data at it, and it will give you a sparse code. And you can see, just in comparison, here's the projection on 4D, and here's the threshold of projection on 2D. You basically just chop off a couple of things. But what that does is it squishes the data in those dimensions down to 0. And so now you're no longer in that 2D subspace in a 4D space, you're in actually a 4D space. A kind of very cool and intuitive coding algorithm for doing sparse codes is called matching pursuit. You recursively subtract the best matching codebook vector from your residual, and your residual at the beginning is your data point. So this is just another way of doing a code where you've squashed a couple of elements to 0. The cool thing about matching pursuit is that it's greedy, and so with every step that you take, you account for more of the data, as much of the data as possible given your current dictionary. So matching pursuit has some failings when the codebook vectors are not orthogonal. And so there's another way to do sparse coding, which is just to flat out optimize a cost function. So what you really want to do is reconstruct the data using your code. So by taking your code and projecting it back through the dictionary and then subtracting out the original data. But you want to balance that with the amount of coefficient that you're willing to use to do that. And so this lambda parameter gives you the trade-off there. And you can see that compared to even matching pursuit, which is here, a sparse code will give you an even smaller code. Sometimes this is really useful. There's some research from Andrew Ng's lab that seems to indicate that this is kind of the best known coding algorithm if you're doing image classification, for instance. Phew. OK, so everyone take another deep breath. So much for coding. You might have had another question, though. How do we get the code book? So we could build it by hand, like all of these telegraph operators in 1901. But that sounds like a lot of work. And so why don't we just learn it from the data? I've put 4 generations of computational neuroscience work here. So Field is the great-grandparent. Olshausen is his student. Lewicki is his student. And Smith is his student. And these are examples of neuroscience results that have used sparse coding to infer a dictionary from natural statistics. So on the left, we have image patches. And on the right, we have sounds. And they're compelling because they actually look like natural receptive fields that you find in organisms. This is a very, very cool result. So it indicates that there are some information theoretic principles that could help us in neuroscience. So kind of the simplest way that people think of to project data into a different space is PCA. All right, so you take your original space, you find the directions of maximal variance in your data set, and you construct an orthonormal basis that represents that rotation in your space. And so this is a really standard algorithm. It's great. It's really useful for just a first step at something if you just don't know anything about your data. But you can never build an over-complete dictionary because it's orthonormal. And also, because PCA makes some assumptions about your data, there might be a structure mismatch. And so in particular, the data that I've created randomly actually have 3 principal axes. And so PCA kind of fails to find those. It treats your data as this blob, and it might be better treated in another way. So what if we just take some samples from the data and use that as our codebook? That actually works pretty well, especially when your codebook is extremely large. It doesn't work very well if your codebook is extremely small, because you might have just randomly sampled some elements from your data that aren't very representative. But again, if your codebook is huge, then yeah, it's pretty good actually. It also depends on what you're doing. If you're doing regression, it's not so great. If you're doing classification, it's a little better. So kind of a compromise is to use something like k-means, where you start out with samples from your data, and then you kind of shuffle them around until they're close to your data. Close in the sense of minimizing total distortion, where distortion is the distance from each point to its closest codebook vector. And you can see that if I use an 4x over complete dictionary, I get a pretty decent representation of my data, of the structure of the data that generated these points. And k-means in particular separates the data along the axes of principal variance. So you can see that there's a point here, and there's a point here, and there's a point here, and there's a point here and here. So this is kind of a cool way to partition your data to cluster it. A related technique is to use the sparse coding loss function and just go ahead and minimize it. But you want to minimize it with respect to D and Z, the dictionary and the code. And so this is another cool technique. It's much slower than the other ones because you're actually computing this complex optimization function. But you partition the data in angle space. And so you get these vectors that kind of point in the general direction of your data. But unlike k-means, they all have the same length, and so they're just kind of pointing towards your data. So it's actually, I'll just mention really briefly here, it's really important to whiten your data in some of these cases, so to center it and make sure that it's about the same size on all the dimensions. And so this whitening interacts with all of these things in kind of interesting ways. So a technique that's gotten a lot of press and definitely has reinvigorated some of these parts of the machine learning research is RBMs. I'll just talk about them really briefly. So an RBM is a probabilistic model that assumes binary units. It's a bipartite graph of binary units. So given a data point x, you can propagate the activity from the network up to the hidden units, what I would call the code. And then you can propagate a code down into the visible units. And you can just keep doing that over and over to your heart's content. And that's actually how we learn D. So you propagate your data up and then back down and up and down and up and down. And you can keep on doing that. But what we really want is for the data at the end to be the same as the data at the beginning. And so even more than that, you want the relationship between the data and the code at the beginning to be the same as the relationship between the data and the code at the end. And so you use the correlations between those two things and take the difference, because when you've actually trained the dictionary, those two correlations will be the same and you'll get no dictionary updates. But when they're different, you can use that delta as a gradient step. So this is a really cool algorithm. It definitely has helped a lot of this research out in the past 5 or 10 years. There's a couple of toolkits that people can use for this, and I'm sure that I've missed a ton of neural networks toolkits. There are lots of them. MORB uses Theano, which is a fantastic scientific computing tool, especially for matrix operations. And I just wrote some code that takes Jeff Hinton's algorithm from MATLAB and puts it into Python, because that's how I tend to understand things. Just to give you some code overdose, here's what an RBM up-down pass looks like in Theano. Theano has this really kind of head warpy way of looking at things. It's really, really effective once you learn how to do it, but it takes a little bit of learning. So you kind of do all your imports, you create a shared array that has your dictionary. Then in these last 4 lines, you set up your computation, but it's important, even though it looks like you're computing things, you're actually not. You're just telling the computer what to do when you give it data. And that's what this function does. It gives you an interface for passing data into the computational graph. Anyway, so Theano is very cool. The tutorial online for Theano includes an RBM example. It's really useful. Whew. OK, and so the last example that I'm going to go over is autoencoders, which you can think of kind of like an unfolded RBM. So you kind of take the up-down pass and just put it all vertical, and then it looks like an autoencoder. So what's the idea? You want to take a data point, pass it through some other representation into another space, and then reproduce that same data point. This is a great unsupervised technique because all you need is data. And hopefully the cost function does the rest for you, right? So you can just have a reconstruction loss. Here's your reconstructed data on the left, and there's your original data. You want to reconstruct your data. And so you can optimize that. And down here, I've put some code that I wrote that basically is just a wrapper around Theano that implements all of the stuff like creating layers and doing the training and all of this other stuff. I should say that the Hessian-free training method is super useful, but it was written by Nicolas, who I've never met, but maybe James, you know him? I don't know. And anyway, it's really, really useful. It's quite slow, but it gives you great results. So one of the cool things about living in cost function land is that you can just add things willy-nilly to your cost function. It's awesome. And if you have a good optimization procedure, then as long as your cost function is actually, has a minimum or something that can be found, then you can do that. So you can control the size of the codebook weights, for instance. So like maybe you don't want very large codebook vectors because you want to keep them regularized. You can also put a sparsity penalty on the code. So this is called a sparse autoencoder. And you want to make sure that you represent your data with using as few numbers on that hidden layer as possible. So you can just throw another term into your cost function there. Or you can do something that's another regularization technique. You add noise to your data before you reconstruct it. I think this is a very cool technique. It's kind of non-intuitive, but the network, from the network's perspective, all it sees is noisy data, and it's expected to reproduce the unnoised data, which is kind of mind-boggling, but it actually works pretty well. And you get nice, nice representations that you get learned, that you can learn as a result. So that's my spiel about different coding and feature learning techniques. I'm going to close just with this kind of brief summary of some interesting stuff from Andrew Ng's lab. This is Adam and Andrew's paper, or I just took a screen grab of it. So it turns out that you can actually learn very similar things from almost all of these algorithms. The really critical parts, now their paper is an image classification task, and so they're using an SVM after they code these image patches. And so for that task, what you really need to pay attention to is the coding algorithm. So it turns out that you can use lots of different things to build your dictionary. You can even sample from the data to get your dictionary. But if you're doing this classification task, the coding algorithm is really, really important. So I just wanted to kind of help emphasize that there's this difference between these two things, and they do different things. As far as I can tell, a little bit less has been explored about regression, because a lot of this coding stuff, particularly the neural networks, has come from the computational vision community, and they're mostly focused on, does this have a cow or a door in it, that kind of thing. And so here are some pointers to a few packages. The scikit-learn package has a really great interface for doing lots of different kinds of codes. You can also do PCA with scikit-learn and all kinds of other awesome stuff. And I think there's even a thread going now on adding a sparse autoencoder or some kind of autoencoder too. So that would be great. Theano is awesome. The two benefits of Theano, in my opinion, are that you automatically get differentiation from your computational graph, thank goodness, and that you can run your code on a GPU or a CPU. You just change a configuration flag. It might not go faster, it depends on what you're doing, but it's there, and it's really, really useful. So there are a few toolkits for RBMs. I think there's got to be a million different implementations of RBMs just out there. I'm not sure, it's just something that you implement, and it's actually not that much code even. So once you've implemented it, it's kind of there. But I always find it helpful to look through other people's code. And this last one, deep learning AIs, that's from Andreas Miller. So I haven't even looked at it that much, but I just found it. And then finally, for neural networks, I have this Theano package. There's NeuroLab, there's PyBrain, there's PyLearn 2, I think someone just mentioned earlier today. There's all kinds of different stuff for neural networks too. So that's it, thanks, and I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're adding artificial error as a regularization step, how do you prevent the algorithm from overlearning particular error realization?
So the question is, if you're adding error to or if you're adding noise to your data as a regularizer, how do you prevent it from learning the structure of the noise that you're learning or that you're adding? That's a good question. My take on that is that the question I ask myself is, how much noise are you supposed to add? And I think that's just one of those hyperparameter things. Maybe if you're hyperop. James, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think when you add that noise, then usually you'll have a certain number of data examples. You loop through the data lots of times. And you add different noise in different iterations.
Right, okay, so the answer is, if you add noise to the examples independently while you're looping over it, then you'll noise the same example in different ways and prevent overlearning that way. But it's true, if you added noise that was right, so so there are convergence problems with that. Yeah, if you add too much noise, it's going to be really, really hard to learn the actual structure of your data. If you add too little noise, you're not going to regularize enough. This is kind of the perennial regularization hyperparameter selection problem. So, any other questions?
Have you tried to implement dropouts as an alternative to noise for autoencoders?
Yeah, so the question was, have you implemented dropouts? And yeah, that's in my neural networks package too. So dropouts are a really cool technique that Jeff Hinton just came up with last year or the year before, something like that, where you randomly set units in your network to 0. And this kind of simulates the unreliability of the neural substrate. He has a great story for why this works, but it actually is quite effective. So it's a cool way to do that.
So I had a question.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to ask about dropout, but I was also going to ask about if you have support for the different types of neurons, like regularized linear units versus sigmoids versus...
Yeah, so another question is, do I have different activation functions? Yeah, I've been finding that, so Vincent Bengio has some papers recently about rectified linear activations, and they're super effective. And you can also learn really deep networks with rectified linear units, which is really nice. So yeah, that's something I've played around with quite a bit too, yeah. Yeah, there are lots of, once you get into neural network, the rabbit hole, it's like neural networks all the way down. But it's really fun to play with, so definitely encourage you to look at that if you're interested.
More questions? If not, we'll thank the speaker again.